So thank you all for inviting me, and welcome to this webinar. When I first accepted the invitation to present at your Lunch and Learn, I anticipated a room with a number of people and maybe a few online, and the world has certainly changed a lot since then. So today the title of my talk is Digging Deep, Understanding Other Ways of Knowing for Effective Collaborations and Engagement with Traditional Knowledges. The presentation builds on 12 years of work I've been doing here at University of Saskatchewan, although I could argue that it began a long time ago. As I begin my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the M.E.S, and depending where you're living, you may be on other treaty territories as well. I pay my respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'd also like to recognize and reaffirm my relationships with the many other beings of this land, including plants, animals, and ancestors. Additional acknowledgements go to a wide number of elders and traditional knowledge keepers with whom I've worked and from whom I've learned a great deal over the past 10 to 12 years. Also to students and colleagues in seed funding from both universities of Saskatchewan and Regina. And in particular, funding from the three projects that I'll focus on in my talk today, which has come from the Canadian funding bodies, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So acknowledgements and thank yous to these supports. Today at my talk, I'll start by saying a bit of my own journey of remembering diverse ways of knowing that are often already there in our bodies and our beings, but have been overshadowed by colonization and assumptions about what counts as legitimate ways of knowing. And for me, expanded ways of knowing also links into bridging the human nature divide that is pervasive in modern cultures. I'll focus on three research projects that support and help us grapple with and understand what it means to engage in different ways of knowing when working and engaging with traditional knowledges. And I'll lead with three takeaway points: that it's a journey. Epistemological stretching is really important, and epistemology is a word I'll use throughout the presentation. It's really a fancy term for different ways of knowing. And this work also requires reconciliation with nature. The journey of stretching your epistemology or expanding ways of knowing is intimately connected with ways of reconciling with the natural world. So in we go. My journey of remembering, as I mentioned earlier, probably started a long time ago as a daughter of a lumbering family in Beaverbank, Nova Scotia. I spent a lot of time playing in sawdust and shaving piles in the lumber mill that my grandfather started back in the 1930s. My first job was with my brother at that lumber mill, working at the mill pond, pulling logs into the hull up with pipe pulls. The two of us would be there with our long sticks and spikes on the end, pulling logs into the conveyor, and together both of us got paid the same as one of regular employees, as long as we could keep the mill running with logs. And we did it pretty well, except for the days when the wind was pushing the logs down to the other end of the pond, and we had to get someone to help bring in the boom and bring them closer in so that we could reach them to pull them into the hollow. As a kid, whenever anybody asked me, what are you going to be when you grow up? One of those inevitable questions, I always said I was going to be a naturalist. Then when I was 17, I landed at Harvard University for my undergrad, which was in history and literature. And I studied how things came to be the way they were and the tensions between individual desires and social norms. And that particular thread runs through a lot of my scholarship today, where I look at how our social norms constrain and support the ways that we are as humans. When I finished my undergrad, I immersed in outdoor and environmental education and was living in Ontario, where I led the development of interdisciplinary and experiential learning programs in high schools across that province. So when I approach this work that I'm talking about today, it's not as a natural scientist, but as an interdisciplinary scholar who brings diverse ways of knowing together to seek collaborative paths forward. In the work that I do, there's a lot of talk about human-nature connection and the artificial divide that has been created by colonization, the artificial divide between humans and the natural world that has been created by colonization and contemporary lifestyles and ways of thinking. So in 2002, I moved from Ontario to come to Regina to start my PhD. And this was my first real introduction to epistemological stretching. I encountered it happened both in the academy, where my mentor there emphasized how important it was to pay attention to the ways that we come to know. And as a budding researcher, I listened very closely to that advice. At the same time, I had a chance encounter with a group of women in Regina who were actively learning to communicate with plants and animals as well. So when I put those two things together, I opened up and gave the land a chance to become my teacher, and started to recognize the many ways of knowing that I had that had been too often pushed aside, particularly in the world of environment where the natural sciences generally dominate. These are ways of knowing like intuition, affective knowing or emotional knowing, and embodied knowing, that have a sense of something physical and perhaps not quite having the words for it. It's those gut feelings and intuition where you know you need to pay attention to something, or you know you need to turn right when really your logical mind is saying you need to turn left. So during that time in my PhD, I had a great opportunity to immerse and explore what those ways of knowing meant for me, in particular in relationship to the natural world. And that led me to the work that I'm doing now, which is really focusing on intuitive forms of communication with animals. And those forms of communication require all of our epistemologies, all of our ways of knowing. When I came to University of Saskatchewan in 2007 as a faculty member, that was the time when I first started actively collaborating with Indigenous colleagues and elders. And in those conversations, I found that I was getting a lot of affirmation for the ways of knowing that I encountered during my doctoral work and used during my PhD. So I started asking questions like, what benefit does engaging these more diverse ways of knowing have for collaborations, particularly in relationship with the natural world and in collaboration with Indigenous peoples? So what I ultimately have discovered is that they're an essential key to understanding many forms of traditional ecological knowledge. The risk is that if we aren't open to or really understand diverse ways of knowing, then we end up filtering what's shared through our own, what is shared with us by elders, by traditional knowledge holders, through our own scientific lenses. And the knowledge itself often gets misinterpreted, sometimes dismissed, or put in this box that's labeled TEK and stuffed at the end of the report. We just don't know how to deal with it. So this notion, one of the two key notions I'm going to focus on today of epistemological stretching, is really essential here. And that means expanding the ways of knowing one respects, understands, and or engages with. And in some ways, it's a stage project or process. If you can respect those ways of knowing but don't understand them, at least they're still there and they're recognized. But the more you understand them, the more you can start to grapple with, what do I do with this knowledge? And don't simply filter it through the lens that you've always filtered knowledge through. So if you engage with it, then that understanding becomes deeper and deeper. So I think of an example of elder knowledge that talks about, didn't prepare an example for this one, but I realize it's probably pretty critical at this moment. An elder who talks about knowledge that comes through the sweat lodge, or knowledge that comes in connection or communication with the bear. And in my previous understandings, I would simply interpret that as, yeah, story. That's just a story. But as I start to engage more broadly in understanding how knowledge comes through us from animals, it helps me interpret that knowledge differently. And it also helps me know the limits of what I can interpret. And when I have to say, I need help understanding this. This is not making sense within my frame of reference, or it's not possible for me to interpret this in a way that's going to be helpful. And that's when I work in partnership with elders to help understand that knowledge. The other key piece that grounds this work is the notion that came from the Truth and Reconciliation Report, which is that reconciliation with nature also requires reconciliation with the natural world. It was a repeated perspective that came through the TRC report. The two go hand in hand, that you can't know the natural, and from the work I do, you can't know the natural world through the rational mind alone. So meeting this point of reconciliation with the natural world requires epistemological stretching. The two go together. So just before I start talking about the three projects that I ground this talk in, I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions, comments, or thoughts that you'd like to share at this point. So we can do this by chat or hands.
It looks like everybody is good to go right now, MJ.
Okay, good. So to explore some of these concepts, epistemological stretching and reconciliation with the natural world real tangibly, I'll take a look at the process and the findings of three projects. And I'll go through each of them at a time. So the first one I'll talk about is human-animal relations as a doorway to Indigenous wellness. The purpose of this project was to create a culturally relevant wellness model for a community at B.Ed First Nation. The study design was a 2-day human-animal communication workshop with elders, knowledge keepers, youth, land management, and health center staff, and it happened at B.Ed First Nation. The workshop foregrounded Willow Creek ways of knowing animals, but it also integrated ways of knowing professional animal communicators, and I'll talk about those more extensively when I talk about the third project. Our data include audio recordings of the whole workshop, individual interviews with participants, focus groups, and participant observation. As a research team, we were there for the entire duration of the workshops. We actually did 2 different workshops. One was more led by the professional animal communicator, and the second one was a thoroughly culturally refined version of that first workshop. The data sources I already talked about. The analysis was done in collaboration with the elders and traditional knowledge keepers. So we traveled to B.Ed for many trips to get our findings clarified, make sure we were interpreting their understandings appropriately. So key findings are that relationships between animals and humans are both physical and spiritual in nature. And the animals are active as helpers, guides, protectors, messengers, teachers, healers, and spiritual amplifiers. These are all published in a paper that's open access. The references are at the end of the paper. In lots of ways, this information may be familiar. What the study did was allowed us to immerse in the lived experience of what that meant for the elders. And there's stories in that paper that amplify what that means. A key point that's different from modern Western assumptions is that animals act with intention, agency, and as partners on the human journey. And that was a really important finding from this study. And that there's also many different forms of two-way communication that include intuitive and spiritual forms of communication, as well as the more typically attended to behavioral kinds of communication. These relationships also, I should note, occurred with both wild animals and domestic animals. And renewing and sustaining those relationships really mattered to well-being of community members, to health, and to their holistic way of journeying through life. We also identified very clearly that colonization has disrupted many of these relationships. On the right is an image of the cover of our workshop guide, which lays out the process that we took and some of the insights shared by the elders on this journey. The second study I'll talk about is the training of future professionals, and it's really 2 studies and a lot of my work as an educator. In addition to my undergraduate, I was trained as an educator and taught in high schools for almost 10 years, high school and outdoor education centers. So this way of knowing drives a lot of my work. So the purpose of this study was to understand graduate students' experiences as they encountered diverse ways of knowing. I run a course in the School of Environment and Sustainability, and both Elise and Katie have been students of that course in the past. And this course really helps people grapple with epistemological stretching in a very experiential and theoretical way. So the first study used educational action research, which really is reflection on practice, and the idea of threshold concepts. Threshold concepts are these ideas that are both transformative, troublesome, irreversible, and integrative. They often are central to understanding of a discipline, and they're often those ideas that are particularly difficult to understand because they fundamentally challenge one's previous ways of understanding a particular field of study. And the field that I'm working in here is sustainability in cross-cultural contexts. The participants over 5 years of the program completed charts which identified learning that was particularly troublesome, transformative, and so forth. The second study, and I'll talk in detail about the findings from both in a moment, is again an educational action research study using intuitive query, and it looked across 2 years of cohorts and student interviews focusing on what their experiences of encountering epistemological stretching were like. So in the first study, we identified 6 of those troublesome concepts that made it particularly difficult to engage in a sustainability learning where the world is animate and open up doors to some of the understandings that are represented in traditional ecological knowledge. The first step was there are multiple ways of knowing, and for some students, they were already there, that was obvious to them, but for some who were intensely trained in one kind of epistemology, in particular those who came through a very intense science background, the notion that there are multiple ways of knowing was a real bridge for them. The second one is the notion that the worldview is the lens through which we see and make sense of the world. The third is that non-human nature actively and intentionally communicates with humans. The fourth was there's 5. Transrational, spiritual intuition, and embodied knowing are valuable and valid ways of knowing. And the last one is the power of dominant beliefs and supports and/or undermines particular ways of knowing as being valid or invalid. I'm just realizing I missed one of the 6, but we'll just carry on. One of the most challenging ones of all of these is the third one, and the last study really picks up on and highlights how we're grappling with that one, the fact that non-human nature actively and intentionally communicates with humans. The second study looked at what graduate students learned in their engagement with epistemological stretching in the course. So one of the key ones was the reconceptualization of relationships, how the relationships with the more than human, in particular, the natural world, got reframed as they started paying attention to those embodied, intuitive, effective registers, which they had been trained to ignore through most of their academic life. Worldview bridging came up again, and not surprisingly, the notion of expanding epistemologies and attending to these different ways of knowing allowed them to see the world in a different way and to recognize that some of the ways of knowing that they were encountering as they would listen to and learn about traditional ecological knowledge were actually ways of knowing that they engaged in as well, but had again pushed aside and made illegitimate or given given them less credibility. And as they worked through the course, they also found that notions of power, what epistemologies or ways of knowing were given credence, were central to their expanding their own ways of knowing. And for some, which was very interesting, some of them Indigenous, some not, they had validation in this course, sometimes for the first time in academia, of ways of knowing that they had previously engaged in, but were really unsure about expressing in academic context. And I would often get comments in the class, it's like, I feel comfortable talking about embodied ways of knowing, intuitive ways of knowing, spiritual ways of knowing here, but then when I go into my other classes, you know, I zip the lips because I don't want to talk about it there. And one of the things that if I had a Venn diagram here, I would suggest that as we acknowledge a larger range of our own epistemologies, the crossover between ways of knowing that each one of you may engage with and use and Indigenous knowledge is much higher. One of the inspirations for this work is an engineering student that I encountered one of my first years at the university who talked about how she often engaged intuition in her personal life, but never thought to engage it in her professional life. Another inspiration for this work is a short quiz that I've given to some of our graduate students for in the School of Environment and Sustainability, where they're asked in the beginning to list all the ways of knowing that they use in their personal life and then the ones they use in their professional life. And it's usually a much smaller one in their professional life. And then we grapple with why and what's left out. And in this bridging between worldviews and Indigenous and traditional knowledge, that expanded set of ways of knowing is really important. And as we start to attend to that and give it more credence, then our understanding of the kinds of knowledge that some of the elders share with us makes a lot more sense. I'm going to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions at this point.
I don't see anything on the chat right now, MJ, and I don't see any hands being put up either.
Okay, thanks. The final piece of work is focused on intuitive interspecies communication by the way of focus on animal communicators. Now, if I back up one slide, 2 slides, this idea that non-human nature actively and intentionally communicates with humans was the most problematic of those threshold concepts. And animal communicators are a perfect set of individuals to explore that idea further. So we wanted to and we are exploring animal communicators and their practices as potential bridge builders across species, cultures, and worldviews. There's very little research on these individuals. There's many books written by them. We have over 50 now in our library in English language alone. And the research questions we're asking, we're really starting at the beginning because there's so little research on this topic. And that's, what is interspecies communication, intuitive forms of it? Who are these individuals, professional animal communicators? And what can we learn from them? In particular, one of the areas we're investigating is key milestones and experiences in their journey to become an animal communicator. And I'm particularly interested in that aspect from an educational point of view, because what is it that allowed them to stretch their ways of knowing, and what resistances did they encounter along the way as they worked doing that? So just a quick definition, our early stage definition of IIC is the experience of immediate and two-way communication between humans and animals, independent of distance. Animal communicators are becoming increasingly visible through their practices, and in our studies, they provide a very accessible way to understand the phenomena of interspecies agency and communication across species outside of an Indigenous context, because it's not a culture-bound capacity, and it's much more accessible to us through the animal communicators' practices. It shows up across many cultures and nations. It's international in scope. Our study found animal communicators in 6 continents. And animal communicators come from all walks of life. The next slide shows the data from our website scan of 93 animal communicator websites. That's not all there is, that's just our beginning scan. And what their previous professions were. Now 54 were unspecified, and 1 animal communicator said that this was their first profession. But many come from the teaching profession, or the most came from the teaching profession. The most common were social workers, zookeepers, veterinary techs, actors, counselors, and marketing folks. And then if you look at the bottom set, there's an incredible diversity of the kinds of previous professions that animal communicators have. It's not, it's often seen as an innate capacity that many humans have, but one that's been pushed aside in modern Western culture in the context of colonization. Interesting also, almost all of them are women. There are very few men who are animal communicators, although the numbers are slowly starting to increase. Emergent findings from this study include the fact that animal communicators help us understand methods for doing research with animals rather than on them. They embody epistemological stretching. They engage a whole range of ways of knowing, including intuition, embodied knowing, affective registers. They also see non-human animals as active, intentional agents and communicative agents. And there's a lot of overlap there with Indigenous kinds of relations with animals. And they really do provide a gateway to engaging with animals as communicative partners. So one of my dream studies in my PhD, who's working on a study intensely interviewing animal communicators and trying to understand what they do, is to be able to use animal communication in the context of wildlife conservation. And this is something that's been done in a whole range of different ways by Indigenous peoples for millennia. The phenomena looks a little different when it's engaged by animal communicators, but by the end of our study and end of my PhD students' study, we'll have a really thick, rich description of what these animal communicators do, and we'll be taking that to the elders to share, and identify what are the parallels. And we anticipate that this could be a really important bridge to help us understand, if you go back to respecting, understanding, and engaging in, from the epistemological stretching slide, to really understand the ways of knowing that the elders are using. And the other piece of our work, of course, is to try and wrap this into a set of ethical guidelines for use of animal communication, because it can be misused as well. The life journeys of the animal communicators, which is another aspect of our study, helps us understand them and this process more deeply. And I kind of already talked about the last point. There is a great resonance between this practice and elders and traditional knowledge keepers, but I would never want to claim they're the same, because we just don't know yet. And certainly the access points and the entryways that the Indigenous people I've worked with into communication with animals is very much guided by local protocols. So offering of tobacco, going into ceremony, for example, which is not the practice of animal communicators in the same way. Yet as my doctoral student Victoria finishes our study, we'll get a better sense of how animal communicators enter that intuitive space where they can work and communicate across species. So in order to really work well with Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge keepers, I would argue that we really need to dig deep into issues of worldview. And an important entry point is expanding ways of knowing. And it can be done intellectually, but it's much more powerful in the experiential form, because it allows us to know in very different ways and to honor our own ways of knowing. And I think this may be particularly relevant for women. I don't want to assume that this is an area where women are stronger, but in our modern Western cultures, certainly women are encouraged to draw on their intuitive, embodied, and affective registers in a way that men often aren't. But that also puts us in tension as professionals with ways of knowing that are generally supported within a profession. So that tension is paramount to attend to. One of the things that brings these three studies together is the notion that animal communicators have demonstrated very clearly to us that this notion of interspecies communication at the intuitive and spiritual level is not a myth and legend. And it's also that it's something that can be recalled, remembered, and learned. Our educational studies show that epistemological stretching, with particular attention to the threshold concepts, can provide building blocks to effective engagement with multiple knowledge holders and multiple ways of knowing. And our work with the elders and community members at B.Ed shows us how important and how active animals are as partners in their lives, not only in physical ways, but in spiritual ones as well. And so in sum, as I think about the whole of my work, it's been both an intellectual endeavor, but also one that's involved an intense amount of my own epistemological stretching. And as I move into the next year, where I'm heading to sabbatical, my intention is to allow the animals themselves to show me how, well, to do that stretching even further, because as I tend to the animals and what they have to say, I both get to a place where my own ways of knowing continue to expand, and my relationship with the natural world, which is essential to reconciliation, becomes stronger. And as I do that, it does take me, and I've seen it take my students in many ways, into this liminal space, this space in between one worldview and the other, which can be quite uncomfortable, but is worth it in the end if, for me in particular, but for others who want to move in that direction, want to achieve that reconciliation with the natural world in a way that allows us to be in full communication with it, and I would say them. I'm going to close there in terms of formal presentation and welcome conversation, discussion, questions. And I don't feel like I need to be the only speaker here. And I know there's two students from my former class who are in the audience, and would love to hear more of your experiences with expanding epistemologies as you've moved out into your professional lives. Thank you very much.
MJ, we did have one question from Carrie.
Sure.
Her question was, what were some of the new ways of knowing that were different from academia?
So I'll start by saying it depends on what part of academia you're talking about, because often what I found in my classes is that my students would say, but we can't attend to emotional ways of knowing, we can't attend to a sensation in our bodies that tell us that we should go left instead of right. And I would say within the modern Western scientific frame that's often dominant in environmental studies, for example, or environmental science, maybe in those cases you don't pay attention to those ways of knowing. But if you're in the realm of the arts, then they're dominant and supported. So, so that's context, and so it's attention to emotion, attention to dreams, attention to embodied knowing, attention to thoughts that pop into your head when you're trying to make decisions, and you're like, where is that coming from? As one form of intuition. Attention to ways of knowing if you journal and spend some time doodling and drawing with both your dominant and non-dominant hands. Things that come to you as you work with clay with your hands as a way of, with a question in your mind, trying to solve a problem. So those are a few of those ways of knowing. Another one, which I haven't explored extensively, but know that I engage is working across realms with the ancestors. And many times when I'm not thinking is when I get those insights. And the same thing happens when I'm working with communication with animals. It's when I'm not thinking, when I'm quiet, that I hear the voices of the animals and what they're trying to tell me. So it's a full range. Some of them are quite familiar, and some of them are a little bit more or less familiar and less talked about. When I talk about the intuitive interspecies communication within my academic unit and most of the academy, that's the one that really gets people a bit kind of like, yeah, really? And on one hand, on the other hand, when people start to think about it, they say, well, maybe that's going on all the time, and I just think that I'm thinking these things, but actually it might be if you live with a domestic animal, the dog or cat or parakeet, just kind of saying that they want you to tend to something.
Okay, we have another question. Yeshu asked, what does situated knowledge mean in relation to ways of knowing?
Situated knowledge, I guess the question I have is, when you mean situated knowledge, I can only make some assumptions about who you're talking about saying that. Donna Haraway talks a lot about situated knowledge, and that means that this knowing comes from a particular place in a set of contexts that make that knowledge relevant and understandable. So what does it have to do with ways of knowing? The ways of knowing and the insights that one gets are always grounded in a context. Now, the animal communicators challenge that notion in really interesting ways because they work globally. So their communication practices are refined to such a degree that they can be connecting and communicating with an animal in, let's say in Norway, yet living in Canada. So most of our understanding of situated knowledge gets a bit blown out of the water by some of their practices. And so I don't have an answer to how to grapple with that, but it's something that we're exploring, is how do we grapple with the notion of knowledge always being contextual in the context of being able to do distance communications that the animal communicators do. Their communications though are always
Anna
contextual.
has a question.
Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, MJ. Anna has a question of what are some tangible steps that policymakers and governments can undertake to advance reconciliation in climate action?
That's a huge question, and I would ground that in a situated context, because each context will be different. The work that I can, and I'll focus on the work that I do, and it's a very individual action, but it's really starting to pay attention to what are the ways of knowing that you as an individual embrace, and what are the ways that you kind of say, not paying attention to that one. And it could be not paying attention to it if it comes to you as a way of knowing that you individually use, or not paying attention to it if somebody else talks about it or through it. And then starting to take steps to say, okay, those, and the word I use often to talk about it is discourse. Those are social norms or discourses that tell me that this is not a valid way of knowing. That would be the most individual practical piece. A second way to let me just pause there for a moment. And the work that I do is primarily educational, and I don't work in the policy realm. So my work is focused on what can we do to help put individuals in a position so that they're better able to understand and interpret what the elders are saying. So in terms of what happens at the policy level, my job and my work is to help people get into a position where they're understanding more and more deeply the ways of knowing that are possible. And then we start reframing how we do conservation work and engage with the animals. That's a ways off, or not. One of the other pieces that's coming to me as something important to think about is, as you're in the field, a scholar, Annette Watson, has done a lot of work in northwestern, actually in Alaska, where the Indigenous knowledge holders who are hired on projects as biologists, one of the things that they talked about is they found it difficult to engage all their epistemologies. They didn't say it exactly that way, but all their ways of knowing and being as they do their work, because they felt they had to funnel it through this Western scientific lens. So as practitioners in the field, when you're hearing people speak about their knowledges, it's about finding the words to invite the full range of ways of knowing that individuals bring to their work. And that takes time to develop. And one of the things I do in my classes, in the multiple ways of knowing class, is I give students a whole range of readings and help them find the vocabularies to talk about knowledge that comes through dreams, knowledge that comes through intuitive knowing, in ways that people around them can make sense of that. So I don't have a what practical things do policymakers do. I can't answer it that way, but I can answer it from an educational perspective.
Okay, next question. Do you have any examples of how other ways of knowing have resulted in solutions to problems that were otherwise unsolvable?
That's such a great question. Give me a moment to think about that for a second for good examples. A lot of them happen in, I'll again take it from my professional life as an educator. And I'll quote a friend of mine who said, there's the plan. And when I say plan, I talk about a lesson plan for a class. And then there's what happens in the shower or in the morning walk or on the drive to work. And in those moments of kind of quiet, often a different plan or insight emerges. So what happens for me a lot, and again, I'm speaking in the educational context, is, and I'll talk about meetings in a moment, is I'll go into a class and I have the plan, but then I have attention to those intuitive and other forms of knowing that shift the plan. And there are times when it is so clear and obvious to me that my original plan, frankly, would have sucked. Made sense in my rational mind, did not make sense in my intuitive mind. Similarly, when I'm in meetings, one of the things that I've learned to do over time is pay close attention to the knowledge that comes through my body. And I now have very clear signals when I feel like my mind is saying, I want to make this point. My body can sometimes, and sometimes it's with my hand, says, nope, shut up now and wait. And what inevitably happens is that someone else makes the point, or a few more points are made which lay the groundwork so that what I say when I say it is much more clearly heard. Whereas if I had said it when I originally thought and wanted to say it, then it would not have been heard in the same way, would not have landed in the meeting. Other ways that I use these ways of knowing are really attending to when the right time is for particular kinds of actions. And it's really being quiet and attending to the epistemologies that I've developed personally that have had the most impact. So if I imagine sitting in a room with individuals who all have these much fuller range of ways of knowing that they're drawing on, think about how much more effective our meetings can be, because we're not pushing as much anymore. We're listening more attentively. both to the knowledge that we have in our minds, as well as the knowledge that comes through our bodies. So those are my most concrete examples, because that's the context that I live and work in. And it's a refined skill set that develops over time.
We have one more question yet. Yeshu asked, have you found in any way that non-European immigrant knowledges complement Indigenous tech? Can Indigenous knowledges from other countries be integrated with tech in Canada?
That's a really hard question to answer out of specific contexts, because different cultural groups will have very specific ways of knowing, but I can answer it again within my educational context that there are a number of instances where students, we have a lot of students in the School of Environment and Sustainability where I work, that come from international countries and have deep connections to some of their indigeneity in those countries. And there's two parts to this. One is some of them, when I find when they're in my class, get a little bit kind of like, hang on, I came here for Western scientific teaching, but I'm getting acknowledgement of the kinds of ways of knowing that my Indigenous and traditional culture supports. And they're both kind of confused about that for a while, but then often very grateful that they're being encouraged to bring those epistemologies into the work that they do. So I think there's a huge amount of resonance across international cultures, but each individual needs to grapple with that, and we can't just say, well, they're the same. Similarly, in that we can't just say all Indigenous cultures in Canada are the same. So my approach is generally to again, work on my own skill in creating space for those other kinds of knowledges to be, and encouraging students to embrace them. I'll talk about a recent example. I just ran a short version of the Multiple Ways of Knowing class this April, which again had a lot of international students, and many of them really focused on the linkages between how they would come to know in their traditional cultural practices and application of how would that be applied in this context. And I can't dictate that. That needs to come from those individuals.
Hi, MJ. I have a question. It's Elise. I really enjoyed your presentation, as always.
Thanks.
And so I was just wondering, how have you worked with your own colleagues on being maybe more aware or open to epistemological stretching?
Sometimes very openly and sometimes very carefully. I work in an interdisciplinary unit, so as we continue to bump up against each other's epistemologies, and I say bump up in a good way, we start to realize that we can't assume things. And that's one of the things I love about the School of Environment and Sustainability. When I was in a different department and it was all the same discipline, we could take so many things for granted in terms of how we came to know. In an interdisciplinary school, that's the beginning place. We can't assume we all are coming to know the same way. So that's one grounding place that I constantly remind myself of. And again, then I use these intuitive sense of knowing to say, when do I speak and how do I speak in a way that I can be heard? So exactly applying the same skills that I teach and the knowledge that I teach in the Multiple Ways of Knowing class, in this moment with this particular individual, what is the right language to use? What is the right language to stay silent about? How will they resonate with that? And that's an intuitive sense. One of the things I learned quite some time ago, as a doctoral student, you're always being asked to prepare your elevator speech. But I found with the work that I do, if I would pause for a moment when somebody asked me what my research was about, then I would find the right entry point for the conversation. If I just gave them the regular elevator speech, then often eyes would glaze over and people wouldn't connect. And the things that actually I ended up speaking were very different than what I was thinking. And that has taken quite some time to trust that what comes out of my mouth will be the right thing at the right time. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's been my strategy, and it's been quite effective over time. The other part of it is I've had to be very patient.
No, that was a great answer. I connected with the grounding of coming together from different disciplines and not always starting at the same spot. And I think that's really relevant for my work, working in the industry and then working with communities. We're not all coming from the same spot. So recognizing that you got to start from the basics or from that grounding step like you described.
Yeah, and it's being sure that you don't make assumptions and creating a safe enough space so people can say more than they might normally say. And that's one of the key things that elders who've come into my classroom have done so well, is as they start telling their stories about engagement with the world in many different ways, suddenly the stories start coming out from the students. They all have these experiences, but they've been silenced and they haven't been given an opportunity to speak about them. And as they start to speak about them and start to explore them in the context of the course, then okay, now I understand when the elder says this is what they're talking about. So it's opening that door and starting to explore and then finding the right words to say it. It takes some time. It's a journey for sure. I want to say one more thing, I think, to close, to directly link back to Indigenous knowledges. Castellanos has written a beautiful short piece that talks about 3 key sources of Indigenous knowledges. One is intergenerational, one is empirical, and the other is revealed. And often when we talk about Indigenous knowledges and traditional knowledges, we recognize the intergenerational knowledge. We recognize the empirical knowledge. It's the revealed knowledge, which is of spiritual in origin or thought to be of spiritual in origin, is the one that we don't recognize. So as you start to stretch epistemologically, you start to understand what those other forms of knowledges are like for you, because they're probably there. And then the realizations start to settle in. You start to cross those thresholds that keep us separate in our knowledge systems. So I love Castellanos' framing because she really does name the kinds of knowledges that we often engage with, intergenerational, empirical, but the ones that we really struggle with, which are the revealed.